after years. The killer, you know, subject of movies, documentaries, everything. But the FBI hasn't done so. The FBI said this is still an ongoing investigation. What is going on there? They're not confirming it.
They're not confirming that it's Post. Obviously, Jesse, I'm like you. I can't crack one of these riddles if my life depended on it, even on the back of a cereal box. But apparently, the case breakers have, and they've identified Post as an individual. And it's more than just this little riddle or the code that was sent to the San Francisco Chronicle. They have the scars apparently on Post's forehead that match the drawing of the Zodiac killer. And they've even gone so far as to interview Post's neighbor, who says that she believes that Post was the Zodiac killer. So they've done an outstanding job, and it's interesting. First, obviously, we dealt with Bob Durst after 40 years, and now more than 50 years, we're getting close to identifying the Zodiac killer. Obviously, he's passed, so if it is indeed Post, he's not going to face the same justice that Bob Durst did.
Yeah, and we know that he was this kind of painter, and there was a wristwatch with paint that was collected from one of the crime scenes. So you can see how it's adding up. I guess the question is, what happens next? You have this large group of investigators who have put in the time, the effort, the resources to identify him. The FBI still not so sure. What are the next steps to 100% confirm it's him? And then if it is him, what happens next in terms of, understanding really his crime spree, and maybe is he responsible for more murders than we know about?
No question. As you mentioned, that Riverside crime scene was helpful with the wristwatch and spray paint. Shortly after Post had a military examination, and we know that Post was ex-military. So, but really, unfortunately, when a criminal defendant dies, even though in a case like this, FBI is going to continue the investigation, try to give the victims' families some sort of closure for the loss of their loved one. There's really not much that can happen in a legal proceeding. The case, essentially, the criminal side goes away. You can obviously pursue a civil case against Post's estate, if any, but unlikely he has any significant assets. So even though the law enforcement side will continue, the criminal prosecution won't, unfortunately.
Well, it's a fascinating update. I'm very curious to see if they make Zodiac 2, with Jake Gyllenhaal, Robert Downey Jr. We'll wait to see. Now, Neama, let me turn to you. These tapes, how could they factor into a prosecution's case, in a potential trial for this conspiracy charge regarding Charles Vello's death? And is there any way a defense attorney could use these tapes to the defense's advantage?
Well, just in any self-defense case, defense attorneys love these types of videos, right? I mean, when we're looking at this in Ahmaud Arbery, where we don't think the prosecution is going to put these videos into evidence because it allows the defendant to get his or her story out without having to take the stand. So if you're a prosecutor, you're not going to put these tapes on in your case in chief. You might use them in cross-examination, but you're going to want to make the defendant, in this case, Lori Vallow, take the stand and actually defend herself, because we know the prosecution can use them, but she can't because it's hearsay. Now, obviously, I agree with Kathy. It's such an incredibly sad case to see Kylie just months before she was brutally murdered and buried in her parents' backyard. So really heartbreaking to see this testimony, and really probably one of the last moments that she was alive that was at least caught on camera. So I agree. Very hard to watch.
Well, not even her parents, Chad Daybell's backyard, which is just so incredible to think about. Yeah, it's a disturbing case. Law enforcement's trying to sort through, are these relevant, credible tips? It's great when people want to get involved, but this is the most high-profile case in the country right now. How do we sort through, are people mistaken? Are people just making things up? Are people uncertain? Because the law enforcement seems to be still focusing their attention on the Carlton Reserve in Florida. They had a drone up there. Walk us through maybe what is going on behind the scenes.
Jesse, very fascinating case because the entire world, especially here in the United States, everyone's looking for Brian Laundrie. This is not typical. And I know there's been a lot of criticism of this case. Why is there so much law enforcement and media attention on this one missing person when there are thousands of other people? Is it because of a race or sex or whatever the case may be? But from a law enforcement perspective, I can tell you that this is great. Now, obviously, you're going to get a lot of bad leads, if you're the FBI, but you only need one good one. And when you have all these folks looking for one person, it can only help your case if you're the FBI.
Why is it significant that Laundrie's father was asked by law enforcement to help with the search? Why do we care about that? Why is that a big deal?
Well, it's a big deal because there's been a lot of criticism of the Laundrie family. You know, Brian comes home without his fiance, their future daughter-in-law, and they didn't take the steps that you would expect an innocent family or innocent parents to take when their daughter-in-law is missing. What do? They went camping. And even when their son disappeared without his, wallet and his cell phone, again, it's not what you would expect folks that really have no involvement in this murder for them to behave. So the fact that Brian's parents, they lawyer up, they call someone in New York before they call law enforcement. They haven't been helping with the search for Gabby before her remains were found, or Brian. I mean, it raises a lot of questions, and that's why people are. I mean, we're not there yet, but they're talking about obstruction of justice, accessory after the fact to murder.
Yes, if it's determined they lied to law enforcement, put them on the wrong trail. I know there was a discrepancy about when exactly the last time they saw Brian was. We thought it was the 14th, and it became the 13th. If something else changes, they could be facing some kind of legal jeopardy. I mentioned before that Dwayne Dog Chapman, Dog the Bounty Hunter, is on the case as well. Let's show you a little bit of that.
Hey, can you push the boat over so Dog can get through there?
I got it.
All right. If you want, I can hold your camera while you jump in if you are jumping in.
I've heard reports that he was trying to shop his search for Brian Laundrie into a show on a major network. I don't know if that's true. He is very highly publicized. I'm not that familiar with his work as a bounty hunter, but he is bringing a different kind of flavor to this search than anyone else. You tell me what you think.
Well, Jesse, if we're looking for an individual, the more bodies, generally, the better. I mean, the last thing you want is someone to tamper with any crime scene or to get themselves killed or engage in any type of violence. But again, I mean, this is something that we haven't seen before. We have a YouTube star and vlogger who's been killed, right? We have a reality TV star bounty hunter who's on the hunt. Again, assuming that he doesn't get in the way of the FBI and other law enforcement who are looking for Brian Laundrie, I don't necessarily think it's a bad thing. Again, when someone's missing, when someone is a fugitive, and we know that Brian Laundrie's already been charged with the ATM theft, the more eyes that are looking for these individuals and the more awareness there is, the better.
At what point do they call off the search? It seems like it's been a long time, but it really hasn't even been a full month yet. At what point do they say, and maybe it's because we're learning new developments every week, but at what point do they say, we have exhausted all of our resources, there's nothing more that we can do, which would be a shame because he holds a lot of answers to many questions that we have. So at what point do they give up the efforts of this search? Because it does seem odd they haven't found him yet.
I mean, at some point, especially with respect to that preserve out there in Florida, you got to sort of question, hey, is this a wild goose chase? Did the Laundrie parents or someone else, send us down the wrong track? Who knows? He may be out of the country, maybe in the Appalachians. This is all speculation, but I mean, they've closed the preserve. They've been searching it for a significant period of time now. And after a certain point, if you're law enforcement, this is just not a good use of resources. You got to give up and regroup and look elsewhere.
Why hasn't he been deemed a suspect in her murder? Is that because they're not entirely sure what happened between the two? Is it because, hey, let's charge him with a lower level offense and get him to put pressure on him to talk? What's the strategy?
Well, he should be a suspect. And again, I know they want to find him first and arrest him first, but there's no doubt in my mind that, eventually, barring some evidence that just comes out of left field, he's going to be charged with her murder. He's the last person to see her alive. He took off. And we know in every jurisdiction in this country, as well as the feds, flight, that's consciousness of guilt, lawyering up and not calling law enforcement. Again, that's not evidence that's admissible at trial. But again, that's not consistent with someone who had nothing to do with his fiance's disappearance. So one is admissible, one is not. But it's just a matter of time before Brian Laundrie is either found dead or he's arrested and charged with murder.
Spinned in a way where he's the innocent party. There's still a lot of questions here. We know that her manner of death is homicide. We don't know what the cause of death is yet. We know that there was a violent episode with them in Utah where she scratched him, he hit her. That's what the allegations are. Is there any way that a defense attorney could look at this case and say, all right, I could spin this, or I could explain this other situation, him being on the lam for so long?
Jesse, this would be a tough one for any defense attorney because, like you said, we don't have that full autopsy report, but we know that this was homicide. And we know that there's a history of violence between the two. And we know that he didn't report her missing and then took off. So I don't know what, if anything, a defense attorney could do with a case like this. I don't do any criminal defense work, thank God. You probably have to blame some sort of third party, but this is a very, very difficult case to defend if you're Brian Laundrie's attorney.
Do you think that Stephen Bertolino, who's representing the Laundrie family, is doing anything inappropriate here? He's come into a lot of criticism in terms of what he knows and is revealing, because one of the strangest aspects, and I'll say it, I said it before, I'll say it again, before we even knew Gabby was dead, he said, we're hoping for her safe return, which if you're a defense attorney and you know she's dead, I know you're not under an obligation to say where the bodies are buried, but to say that comment, that says to me either, he knew she was dead and said that anyway, or Brian Laundrie didn't tell him anything. And Brian Laundrie didn't tell him what maybe he said she's alive. Last time I saw her was alive, or maybe he lied and said she was alive. What do you make of that?
Well, there's a few possibilities here, right, Jesse? And we know that criminals lie to their attorneys all the time. So the first possibility is that Brian lied to his attorney. The second is that Brian lied to his parents, and the parents had no idea what was going on, and they communicated that information to the attorney. But ultimately, if you're an attorney, the last thing you want to do is get involved with any sort of definitive factual statements when you're relying on your client, who has every incentive to lie. Rarely do defendants admit the truth to law enforcement or even their own attorney.
They're saying, all right, so you're just saying it's inconclusive data. Maybe the bullet will match the gun. Maybe you're a hired gun, $250 an hour. And also, they tried to suggest on cross-examination that he sent the defense an email saying, quote, that he could make adjustments as needed, making him look a little bit more like a hired gun. What do you think?
Thought the prosecution scored a lot of points here. I agree with Anna. The ballistics expert wasn't the best witness, but the government doesn't need it. There's so much other evidence in this case. So, the defense scored a couple points here, but really it's a red herring because we know that there was issues with the firearm, right? Gooch's own brother was charged with obstruction for, handling the firearm after the murder. And the cell site evidence, if you want to talk about forensic evidence or direct evidence, the cell site evidence, the phones are together, the defendant and the murder victim, there's these offensive text messages. The defendant himself lying about his whereabouts at the time of the murder. The prosecution has a very, very strong case. If the defense poked a couple holes here or there, it's not going to change the ultimate outcome in this case, in my opinion.
Does he have? Do you anticipate a situation where if he's picked up, he's now facing a charge which he was not facing when he first came back to Florida? Do you think he would lawyer up again, or do you think he would provide information?
No question. I think he will lawyer up. His family has already lawyered up. And generally speaking, in murder cases, there's two broad categories of defenses. It wasn't me, or it was self-defense. So the reason law enforcement doesn't want to tip their hand is if it does go in that self-defense route, you want to make sure that evidence that can rebut that self-defense argument or defense, you don't give to your criminal defendant. So that's what I expect. But I don't expect, if and when Laundrie is found and arrested, I don't expect him to talk to law enforcement at all. Probably going to be straight to trial the next time we hear from him.
Let's call it what it is. He says he does a quick swing by this area where this Mennonite church is, and really in reality the evidence shows that he was there for 3.5 hours. So it becomes a battle with, is he being dishonest, deliberately dishonest, or is it a question of maybe he doesn't remember certain details because he's being questioned in April about something that happened in January?
Jesse, Mark Gooch is being dishonest. Let's just put it out there. There's no question. He lies about his whereabouts. He lies about how long he's been there. And let's go back to his phone. Not just the cell phone evidence. He wipes his phone. Tries to delete his search history dating back to the beginning of time. And then we know what he was searching for. He was searching law enforcement's Facebook page for missing woman Kraus or something to that effect before they'd even announced the investigation. So all that is terrible if you're the defense. So I know that, like I said, we talked about the forensics and the bullet, but anytime you have a defendant that lies to law enforcement, and it goes back to Brian Laundrie and Gabby Petito, not that he lied, but jurors are going to use their common sense, and they're going to say, is this behavior consistent with someone who's not guilty or consistent with someone who's guilty? And lying to law enforcement is about someone who's guilty.
Nowhere near there. They're saying, no. He went to go to Flagstaff, wanted to check out the ski resort, closed, then goes to check out the Mennonite community. He was interested in checking it out, wasn't open, there were no services, and then he left, again, did that quick swing by. And then they say, with the cell phone evidence pinpointing him in this location, how accurate really is that data to suggest, pinpointing him in these specific spots, including the burial site for Sasha Kraus. But I do find that a fascinating defense put forward there. What do you make of it?
Well, I think you have to admit something if you're the defense. Obviously, the initial denial of being in Flagstaff, that was a terrible thing for Kraus to do, put the defense behind the 8 ball, and then ultimately saying he went to a ski resort that was closed because of COVID, even though this was 2 months, before COVID. That was bad. And then going to the Mennonite church, which you admittedly dislike, on a Saturday, and just the whole discrepancy with the timeline. This is all bad, but you really got to kind of embrace it if you're the defense. Get in there, because the last thing you want is a lying client or a lying defendant. Ideally you have a stone cold alibi, which they don't have. So you really got to kind of get in there and address a lot of these bad facts if you're the defense, but it's going to be tough.
Well, I do want to focus on this aspect. If he went in there not knowing that he was about to be interviewed by police about Sasha Kraus, he was brought in there under the ruse of something else. Does he seem overly nervous? I don't get that. I don't see him overly nervous, as we've seen other defendants and other suspects. Does that play a factor in your analysis there?
It's tough to get into the psychology of folks. We have people that really show no remorse whatsoever. We're talking about Lori Vallow just earlier in the show. Here's someone who, her husband is dead, and she takes the kids to school and then Burger King and Walmart. Or Burger King school, then Walmart. Some people just react differently to killing. This is someone who's a veteran. I know the defense has sort of played up that aspect of it, but this is someone that is familiar with firearms, has really some really offensive text messages about the Mennonite community. This is not someone, just by his own brother's testimony, that's a really emotional type fellow. Comes across as a little bit heartless. So I'm not surprised at his demeanor during this interview.
Bullet came from the gun. Is that a major problem for the government? Because they have put forward a ton of strong evidence, from cell phone evidence to witness testimony to the text message exchanges to the search history of the defendant suggesting he is the killer. But for the jury not to know exactly if that's the murder weapon, is that a problem for a jury? Is that going to be a holdout? Because clearly the prosecution waited to the end to really hit that slam dunk with the murder weapon, and it wasn't a slam dunk. It wasn't a home run in any which way. Is that a problem?
Look, it's a potential problem, but I don't think ultimately it's going to result in a not guilty verdict or a hung jury. This is why, because there's so much other evidence in the case. You see prosecutors use all sorts of analogies here. You'll see them write G-U-I-L, blank Y, just leaving the T there. You don't need every single letter, but the jury can connect the dots and find a guilty verdict. Especially again when there's all this other good evidence. Now, what the prosecution should have done is prepared their witness better. I love law enforcement, but sometimes they're not good witnesses because, frankly, they're not used to being cross-examined and poked and prodded and questioned. And this witness clearly was not. And if you do have a shaky witness like this, you need to sandwich them in the middle of the case between better witnesses. You want to start strong and end strong. So there were some mistakes made by the prosecution here. But again, I think the defendant's interviews, the detailing, the wiping the phone, those offensive text messages, the cell site evidence, everything else together points a very damning picture for Gooch. I still think they're going to get a guilty verdict. You don't need a body, you don't need a murder weapon to get convictions in murder cases. I think the state has plenty here.
But let me challenge you here. The jury is still asking questions of these witnesses, even to this point, which signifies to me maybe they're undecided about an issue. And number two, if the defense, which I think did a stellar job of cross-examining the state's expert, and I think their own expert was stronger than the prosecution's, does that bleed over into other things that the defense has questioned the prosecution about? And maybe a juror will say, well, you know, now that they make that point, let me go back to what they said about the cell phone evidence. Maybe it's not that accurate. Could that happen?
Yes, yeah, I'm not law enforcement anymore. I love being questioned. So, look, state of Arizona is a unique jurisdiction. Jurors can ask questions. You don't typically see that. There's some states that have it. In the federal, in the grand jury side, grand jurors can ask questions. So the jurors in this case have been pretty engaged. They've been asking questions of most of the witnesses, almost all of them that I've seen. So nothing really unique here for this particular panel. They've been pretty engaged, providing the judge questions. Some of them really have nothing to do with the charges in this case. So I don't think that changes anything. And again, I like what the defense here, they did a good job with this particular witness. But if I'm the prosecution, I just show up during summation and I say, listen, even if you don't think this was the murder weapon, even if you don't believe this witness, it doesn't change the fact that, you know, Kraus was murdered and she was murdered by Gooch. I mean, it's just that simple. You know, Jesse, I've seen a lot in the past 20 years or so, but I've never seen anything like this. Obviously, Nicholas Cruz, just this whole jury selection has just been so incredibly difficult. You have prospective jurors crying. Obviously, he's allegedly responsible for the most deadly school shooting in U.S. history, likely facing the death penalty. Now you kind of hear you have the state, you know, fighting with defense counsel over this Pikachu coloring situation. Judge Elizabeth Schur, she's been criticized in this case. The defense actually tried to have her recused. She ultimately ended up not even ruling on the issue. And, you know, there was a clip that happened later where she said, well, you know, the jailers provided a pen and Cruz has to use the pen that's provided by the jailers. He can't use any coloring pencils or any other pencils at all. So really sort of very bizarre situation and a really bizarre case. I mean, there's video of this assault and battery. And the only reason I think this case is even going to trial is because it's something that the jurors can consider if he's convicted in the penalty phase.
Let's talk about that. So that's why it's significant. You think the murder charge is, oh my gosh, what do we care if he attacked a guard? But if he's convicted, how could that play for the sentencing and possible death penalty?
Absolutely. I mean, that previous felony conviction can come into play. Any kind of crime of violence. I mean, this is someone that you see in the video really with no provocation whatsoever, ends up, you know, flicking off the guard and attacking him, punching him in the head. So pretty violent behavior from someone that certainly wants to come across, at least at trial, as not being violent. Really, the only thing you can do in a case like this is try to get your client off death row, avoid the death penalty. It's going to be very, very difficult for his defense team in the Parkland case. So the last thing they want is a conviction in this particular case.
Any way for them to get an acquittal here? Because it seems pretty straightforward.
I really do think it is. Maybe you get one juror that feels bad for him, but I mean, they can't even get a panel because everyone in the country has heard of the Parkland shooting. So it's going to be very difficult. I think this is going to be a very easy conviction for the prosecution. Which
is interesting to say, considering that his lead attorney actually got sick and was hospitalized, and the judge said, look, he's got competent counsel, there's other attorneys, she even seemed to suggest this is a really straightforward kind of case. You have a 2.5-minute video, but I'll be interested to see where the defense tries to go with this and who ultimately will be selected for this case. The judge did say to the jury, you are not deciding the Parkland shooting. This is only about a separate issue, a completely separate issue. We'll see if they actually listen to that. Do you get the sense that there was a plot to kill Charles, or he went there? Remember, there was an idea that Lori and Alex both knew that Charles was plotting this kind of intervention for Lori. Alex denied that to police, but ultimately, do you get the sense that from those interviews that they plotted to kill him that day?
Well, obviously, Arizona authorities now think there's enough evidence to charge her with conspiracy to commit murder. We don't have all the evidence. Finally, they just released this video. Let's not forget, for years, they said that this was self-defense and this was justified. Obviously, Alex died of natural causes, so there was no way to charge him. But there's got to be something, some text message, some witness, because for conspiracy, you need that agreement beforehand. So I know law enforcement has something they're not sharing, because otherwise you would have no conspiracy charge here.
Do you think the defense did enough, really only called, I think, like 2 witnesses, including their own firearms expert, and the state not putting on a rebuttal? Your reaction?
I don't think the state needed to put on a rebuttal. We knew that the forensic witness, the ballistics expert, was weak. Obviously, the defense scored some points there with their own expert. There's really nothing to rebut. They didn't put any evidence challenging the cell site evidence, the defendant's own testimony, the really sort of strong evidence that the state put forward. I think they put a very compelling case. I think they will get a guilty verdict out there in Arizona. So not surprised that they didn't put on a rebuttal witness, because really there's nothing to rebut. Their own ballistic expert did get beat up on cross-examination, but that's about it. And the defense had to play with the cards that they were dealt, and they had a good hand with respect to one particular area, but there's not much they could have done with respect to the other evidence. That
Mark viewed the Farmington Police Department Facebook page. We know in February he viewed an article on Sasha being missing, and the question becomes, is he looking at it because this was a big thing that happened in the Mennonite community, or was he looking at it because he's the killer? And even before he was a suspect, even before he was arrested, it seems a bit curious. I mean, he was questioned about it. What do you make of this?
Yeah, curious is to put it lightly. I mean, that's evidence of guilt, right? He's looking for information and evidence before it's even made public, right? So, I mean, that's something that he must have known about before it became readily known to the media, the fact that she was murdered. I mean, it was just a missing persons case at the beginning. So, I really love what law enforcement did during this interview. I mean, it was really 101. The first thing you want to do is lock your suspect into a timeline. Doesn't matter what he or she says. Once you get them locked in, it's very hard for them to deviate and change their story to match the evidence. So that's one thing that the detective did. The other thing was to get him to make those inconsistent statements. Hey, had you talked to any family members about this case or the Mennonite community? Krauss answers no, and we know that those damning text messages were out there. So really outstanding police work during this particular interview.
Is he behaving like he should be behaving? If someone is accused of a crime, he seems so quiet, so timid. I can imagine other instances where if they said, did you have anything to do with this? Absolutely not. Of course not. But I know everybody reacts differently. What is your take on viewing this interrogation tape?
Yeah, people do react differently. Some people will feign outrage. How dare you accuse me? Other people will be matter of fact. I've seen it all. Thousands of different video interviews of defendants or audio interviews. But there's no really one way to handle this type of accusation. But what I can tell you is that most criminal cases come down to 2 things: likability and credibility. Now, obviously, in murder cases, the likability and credibility of your victim doesn't matter because he or she is murdered. So you turn to your defendant. Now, the defense wants to make him likable. I mean, they've talked about it. Here's a veteran. Here's someone who has no criminal history. So what does the prosecution do? They show these really highly offensive text messages. I mean, he's texting his brother, who's a police officer, who's bragging about potentially giving some Mennonites COVID, and they're laughing with one another, really offensive stuff there. And then credibility, when you have a defendant who testifies. Now, obviously, Gooch didn't testify in this particular case, but he essentially did with that law enforcement interview. And there's his brother. I mean, I know he didn't want to testify, but that was very damaging testimony for Mark.
Do you think this is going to help the prosecution or maybe hurt the prosecution now that they've identified another person?
Well, it can go both ways, but I like it for the prosecution because we know what every criminal defense attorney is going to do. It's criminal defense attorney 101, attack law enforcement, say this was a sloppy investigation, shoddy, rush to judgment. There's all these other folks that, were potential suspects that law enforcement didn't really consider. They just assumed it was our guy or our girl, and that's why they manipulated all the evidence to prove that this innocent person is guilty. Well, we know that's not the case, obviously, because this investigation took months, and the fact that, you know, this particular agent was very transparent that, look, I wrote search warrants for other people. You know, I talked to the DA and the judge. You know, I thought I had probable cause here to get some information. But ultimately, the reason I didn't pursue Kuhn is because of X, Y, and Z. I ruled him out. He had an alibi or whatever. There was no evidence connecting him to the murder like we have with Gooch. So I like the transparency with law enforcement. I think that's what jurors are going to like, and I think that's what helps rebut this sloppy investigation.
Why this man, Mark Gooch, targeted Sasha Krause in particular and killed her, is that going to be a hang-up for a jury?
Potentially, but I don't think so, and this is why. Obviously, as a prosecutor, you want motive. You want motive means opportunity. But I think they did a good job showing that animus towards the Mennonite community. I mean, someone that, you know, put that in text message with law enforcement, someone whose brother said that, look, he had a difficult upbringing and was somewhat resentful towards the Mennonite community. I think the prosecution established motive. And there's going to be jury instructions that say that they don't actually have to establish motive. It's not an element of any crime. And, you know, on law and crime, we've had no motive cases, and they've resulted in guilty verdicts. Just most recently in North Dakota, that really just gruesome murder of 4 folks there, no motive whatsoever. So jurors don't need motive if you have all the other evidence, which I think the prosecution does have in this case.
Closet. You hear Samuel Kuhn says it was. You've heard other witnesses say that it was completely dark. You even heard Juanita Kuhn speak about it. I know it's such a slight issue, but the fact that he said that and maybe contradicts something else, is the jury even going to remember that? Is the defense going to highlight it at all in a closing argument?
Defense probably will highlight it, but again, there's jury instructions that say these types of innocent misrecollections are not uncommon. So if I were the prosecution, I would just say, listen, it's normal. This is something that happened years ago. Let me tell you what I do like about these witnesses. These are witnesses that were called by the prosecution, right? They weren't hiding anything. The last thing you want is for the defense to call these folks. If you're the prosecution, you want to get out ahead of it. So it called both Samuel and Juanita Kuhn. They testified. I thought they testified pretty credibly. They didn't invoke or assert the fifth. That might have been a potential problem. And ultimately, like I said, even though they may have been at or near the scene of the murder, their cell phones weren't pinging with the victim. You know, they weren't wiping their phones, and all the other things that are a problem for Gooch aren't a problem for the Kuhn. So, you know, that innocent misrecollection about the light, I think that's something that the jurors will not really focus on. I mean, because let's be honest, we're all normal people, and some of us don't even remember what we had for breakfast this morning, much less if a light was on, you know, at a church, right, you know, or any other building 2 years ago.
So I can hear the prosecution in a closing argument highlighting all of the evidence that we've talked about. What should the defense do in a closing? Because I thought they did a terrific job with some cross-examination. What should they do in a closing argument that will remain in the minds of the jury?
Well, one thing that they did during opening a bit, which is not necessarily proper, but really kind of talk about, you know, their client is someone that has zero criminal history whatsoever. This is a veteran. This is not someone that had any real reason to be violent. There's no history of violence. Now, did he make some off-color, inappropriate remarks with his brothers? No question. And that, but really, you know, just because you're, you know, a racist or a bigot, does that make you a murderer? Again, I'm not saying I agree with this, but this is the argument I would have made if I were forced to be the defense attorney in this case. And then obviously we talked about the ballistics. Just say, listen, there's no kind of evidence that ties this murder weapon to Gooch. So I think that's what you got to do here, and just pound reasonable doubt and hopefully get 1 or 2 jurors on your side. That's as good as it's going to get for the defense here.
I don't know. You tell me.
I mean, there has to be something, right? Apparently, they did find some sort of campsite at the reserve today. There's something law enforcement knows that we don't know, because they are directing almost all their attention on the preserve, whereas callers, this particular one...
I actually do want to interrupt. The police said that they didn't find a campsite at this nature reserve. I know there were reports about it, but they confirmed that they did not find that campsite.
Oh, they did not. So those were wrong reports. Well, I mean, look, they have to know something that we don't, right? Because they are directing all their attention still at this preserve. You know, they're not searching the Appalachian Trail. They're not searching other jurisdictions. So for some reason, and these are the feds, they generally know what they're doing when they're finding people. They believe that Laundrie is there. It could be misinformation by the parents. It could be something that we're just unaware of. But it's not surprising that you have callers like this that are almost positive, right? In his own words, 99.99% sure that he saw Brian Laundrie. We still have people who are claiming to see Tupac and Biggie at the gas station. So I mean, that is one of the drawbacks of having so much media attention on a case like this.
And as much as people want answers to this from an outside perspective, think about what the Petito family wants out of all this. They need some closure and answers as well. So the question is, what is next for them? Huge announcement. What is happening behind the scenes? How is this going to unfold? Predict it for us, because we know that there was a warrant out for his arrest on a very minor charge compared to, a murder charge. But we also know that the manner of death is homicide. So those conversations are going to happen behind closed doors. What do you expect happens?
I expect that he's charged with murder. There may be a grand jury indictment that's under seal. If not, the U.S. Attorney's Office will immediately go to the grand jury and get that indictment. You're certainly not going to let him go. And it seems like both for the feds in terms of law enforcement and in terms of prosecutors are already involved. So I expect this case to go federal. And again, there's many reasons for that. Obviously, you're dealing with a multi-state kind of not a crime per se, but a multi-state investigation that's better suited for both federal law enforcement and federal prosecutors. So he's not someone that's just going to be charged with just the ATM unauthorized use issue.
Would he also be charged for evading police, something to do with evading police here, or obstructing justice, in the sense that, he's at large and everybody's trying to find him?
Yeah, no question, right? I mean, here's someone who has left without a trail. Now, the question is, was he contacted by law enforcement? The answer is yes. Was he ordered to stay lawfully, and did he flee? But ultimately, if he was not aware of law enforcement looking for him or the arrest warrant for the ATM card, then there really is no theft. But if he was aware, no fleeing. But if he was aware, then absolutely he's going to be charged with anything and everything, from kidnapping to the violence to the fleeing, all of it, obstructing justice.
A group of investigators, very well trained, come from different walks of life, put a ton of time and resources into this, and they say they have identified the Zodiac killer after all this time. However, the FBI didn't confirm that. They said this is still an ongoing investigation. Why has the FBI not confirmed that?
Well, the FBI is obviously operating by a different set of rules, right? Members of the public can say what they want. You and I can say here and say that, for instance, Brian Laundrie's parents should be charged with obstruction or accessory. But, as a former prosecutor, I would be held to a higher standard. I can't say something like that until I'm ready to proceed with the case and believe that I can prove it beyond a reasonable doubt. So that's just the difference between law enforcement and prosecutors and members of the public. And, the case breakers are members of the public. But what really has changed over time is technology. We've talked about over the past several hours, including cell site evidence, search history. Now you got software that can be used to break these codes. Before, you'd have these really sort of intelligent people with the FBI or CRA that would try to crack these codes. But now you have computers, and as we saw, that can do it for us. So technology has really changed the game for both law enforcement and folks who are working on these cold cases. And this is a clear example of it right here with respect to the Zodiac killer.
Yeah, we've covered a number of cold cases that have heated up through the use of genetic genealogy, which we've seen in the Golden State Killer and the Jerry Burns case. But here, saying the forehead with the scars and the paint that was found on one of the watches, we have about 40 seconds. How confident are you that this is the guy?
I'm much more confident than I was before they got involved. So I think based on the witness testimony, the Riverside evidence, by the witness, I mean the neighbor, and the scars and the code, that we more likely than not have finally found our Zodiac killer.
Pretty incredible to be thinking about after all the movies, the documentaries, the shows, the newspaper articles, the victims. To think about we have a face behind the killer, incredible. And I'm glad we had an opportunity to talk a little bit more about it. Neama, Rahmani, thank you for sticking with me for 3 hours. I really appreciate it.